Today, I wanted to introduce to you a new technique that many of you may be unfamiliar with for dealing with particular scenarios where a subject property is heavily damaged and the market for that property is really just going to be an investor. And when you have that market niche, the market dynamics are different than a more typical market where your buyer is going to be the owner occupant of the property. When you have an investor buyer, then you have a market where rate of return becomes an important consideration that impacts the actions of the investors in that market. In fact, it's a requirement if somebody's going to be funding a project through a hard money lender, a fix and flip program. There's going to be actual requirements for a rate of return. So there's a calculation that's done, and it really sets what's known as your minimal acceptable offer. So you can't go out there and offer a price for the subject property that's not going to achieve a minimum return. So that market dynamic is something that the investment residual technique can mirror and use to support an opinion of as is market value for a property that is heavily damaged and it's in this particular investment market niche. So let's look at how this works. So in this scenario, you're going to be starting with the end in mind. So what's your post-rehab value? Often that is the easiest thing for an appraiser to support. You're most likely in a market where you're dealing with this type of property. You're going to have remodeled homes. You're going to have flipped properties. You're going to have a real good understanding of what an investor is going to do when they take this property and renovate it for resale. So we're working backward from that number. And so the way this is set up is we're actually working backward to the top. So we're wanting to know, as is, what is an investor going to be offering for this property based on their targeted return. And so we need to know post-rehab value. We also need to know what it's going to cost to fix the property. That's also something that a lot of times you're going to have some good data on, depending on the specifics of the particular subject property. Maybe you have some insurance estimates for rehab costs. Maybe you're working with a particular investor that has relationships with remodelers who they may already have bids in hand for repair costs. You as an appraiser may have a lot of experience estimating repair costs. So wherever those come from, those are the two big numbers that you're going to be using in order to understand, okay, what is a price that needs to be paid in order to achieve a return. So there's some other factors here. How long is this project going to take? And what are other holding costs, insurance, and taxes? What are closing costs? In this particular case, we have no lending factors in here because in this case, these target returns are unleveraged. So typically when investors are having to pitch a project, they're needing to prove an unleveraged return of a minimum amount. So that's the other thing. So what is that target return? That's something that based on your market and your project type, there's going to be a band of returns that are going to be required. And so out of that band, you select the target return, which best fits this project and your market. And then you can solve for the acquisition cost. So let's do that in this scenario. Let's say I don't know, I've already calculated it here, but let's say I don't know what that acquisition cost is going to be. Well, I can randomly test numbers. If If I put 200,000, that's 32%. That's a higher return than is required. If I put 275,000, that's way low. It's somewhere in there. Well, I can do these iterations manually, or I can use a tool called Goal Seek. And in Goal Seek, I'm going to set my project return. So I'm setting my cell, that particular cell, to 20%. And I want to achieve that by changing the acquisition cost cell. That's the as is value. What's the as is value if I have to achieve a target return of 20%? That's 231,000. So that is our result from all the iterations that GoalSeek did within Excel. So, okay, 231,000, I like that. So it achieves me 20%, and that becomes a supported as is value for the subject property, given this investment approach. So this derivative of the income approach is really helpful in this circumstance. It's also helpful if you are working in say you're doing the income approach and you are developing a sales comparison at the same time. This can also help you to support adjustments for conditions. Say I have a remodeled home and I need to make an adjustment for condition. This method can actually be a method of support for those adjustments. So in this case, the lump sum difference between the as is and post rehab is 169,000. That's about $85 a square foot based on the subject's gross living area. So that is another helpful data point to be taking across approaches to help. Another thing, you may have investor clients, and maybe you're working in more of a consulting capacity with them. You can take this a step further and say, okay, we have done that analysis to find out what the value of that property is based on how we're estimating the post-rehab value and construction costs. But you're telling me you want to leverage it. So let's see what your returns would be with leverage. And let's look at, do we want to include like a risk margin? Well, what if you don't get the price you think you're going to? What if things change during the course of your project? Something else comes up. This is a way that you can incorporate lending costs and look at how much the rate of return, the actual cash on cash rate of return for this investor, how variable that's going to be with changes. So I can put lending terms in here. If we have a loan where they're paying 1.11% interest and they've got a 70% cap on the loan amount, that's usually based on the post-rehab value. So, okay, if we're maxing out our leverage on this property, that bumps the return to 67%. Okay, that's great. But what if we want to say, if things don't go as well as we think, maybe we have a 5% less net proceeds at the end than we thought we would. What's that going to do? Okay, that's going to drop my return to 40%. Okay, maybe that's still within an acceptable range. What if it goes to 10%? Okay, that's a pretty healthy margin for risk. Well, that drops my return down really low. My profit's $8,000 at that point for this project. You may be thinking, well, that's still positive, but not where I'd really like to be. But that's assuming that there's been mistakes of $40,000 either in pricing or maybe repair costs, things like that. And if it's repair costs, that would actually change the calculation a little bit differently. You would probably want to change that on the other tab. This is more risk margin based on, hey, what if I don't get the price I think I'm going to at the end of this project, or the market has changed a little bit. So that risk margin is really focusing on the net proceeds not being what you thought they would be. So that's a way that you can use the same technique, just with some added terms, and you can calculate a different type of return for your investor client. So that is the derivative of the income approach that I'm calling the investment residual technique. You see a similar technique used in land valuation, but you don't see this as much as for improved properties and residential appraisers. So here's another tool in the tool chest. You may have already done this. Maybe you've got a spreadsheet just like this. Maybe you've done this more on a back of the napkin, and this is giving you sort of a different way of looking at it. I just wanted to put that out there. Hope it's helpful. Thanks.